Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the American Antiquarian's Public Society's public program, the Colonial Cabbala of the Jews at the American Antiquarian Society, with Rice University Judaic Studies professor Brian Ogren. We welcome you from the ancestral homelands of the Nipmuc tribal community, who remain an active presence here at Central Massachusetts. I'm Kevin Wisniewski, Director of Book History at AAS, and I'm joined today by Elizabeth Pope, Curator of Books, and Amanda Kondik, Programs Coordinator here at AAS. We have some newcomers here this afternoon, so I want to say a few words of introduction to the American Antiquarian Society, a national research library and learned society in Worcester, Massachusetts. We collect, preserve, and share materials printed and produced before 1900 in what is now the United States, portions of Canada, and the Caribbean. Our collections include books and pamphlets, newspapers and periodicals, manuscripts, and the graphic arts and ephemera. AAS supports and welcomes scholars and readers from around the world to use our reading room as well as our digitized materials to work on their own research projects. In addition, we offer regular programming like this one, and I invite you to join us for upcoming programs in the weeks to come. This afternoon's program is part of a series called Perspectives from the Collections, which offers a closer look at some of the unique items in our holdings. You can go to our website to explore upcoming programs and other series, including those related to nature and the environment, women's history, artists in the archive, and the history of the book. Before introducing today's guest, I want to offer a quick overview on the platform we're using today. First, closed captioning is available via Zoom's live transcription. You can turn the closed captioning on and off with the button labeled CC on the bottom of your Zoom screen. Throughout the program, we'll post relevant links and information in the chat. If you'd like to save the chat to have links for future use, you can save a transcription by opening the chat window and clicking on the three dots at the bottom right corner. For the Q&A portion of our program, we'll be using the Q&A function located on the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you have any questions for our speaker, please type them in there. Now, the Q&A also has an upvote option. So if someone posts something you'd like to see discussed, be sure to click the thumbs up icon. You can place your questions into the Q&A there at any point during the program. Finally, we are recording this program and we will make it available on our website and our YouTube channel in the weeks to come. Now I'd like to turn things over to my colleague, Elizabeth Pope, who will introduce today's guest.
Hey everyone. One of the most exciting parts of my job as curator at AAS is seeing historic materials from the collections brought out so people can use them. After all, why else are we keeping them safe here if not to share them? Reader Services staff find items for researchers in the dark of the climate-controlled stacks where they're kept physically safe and deliver them out into the brightness of the reading room or to spaces like this in our learning lab, where people can use these pieces of evidence from the past, perhaps in ways we've never considered. Staff members like Kevin and I get the privilege of glimpsing the workings of a research process in real time. When AAS collection materials are going out across the reference desk, or when a researcher is returning an item and excitedly shows us what they've learned. Today, we're partnering with one of those scholars, Dr. Brian Ogren, to provide you all with a glimpse of that process too. Dr. Ogren will guide us through some of the work that went into interpreting pieces of historic evidence like these, in particular this one manuscript, and turning them into a research monograph like this. And I will be providing the hands for the hands-on part of this webinar as we go along. Brian Ogren is the Anna Smith Fine Associate Professor of Judaic Studies at Rice University. He specializes in Jewish thought, concentrating on philosophy and Kabbalah in the early modern period. Dr. Ogren is particularly interested in textual exploration, including manuscript study, reception theory, and theories and methods of interpretation. He has edited 2 volumes and authored 3 monographs, most recently in 2001, The Cabbala and the Founding of America, The Early Influences of Jewish Thought in the New World, published by NYU Press. Dr. Ogren is currently working on a book project related to cinematic representations of Jewish mysticism, and he has begun another extensive project on early modern Jewish notions of love. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Ogren, to open up some of your process researching Kabbalah in early America.
Okay, thank you. Hope everybody can hear me. Getting it on. Okay, yes. So first of all, I want to thank Elizabeth and Kevin for hosting this event. And I especially want to thank the American Antiquarian Society for making available to the public some really extremely important historical documents. It's very much a great service to an understanding of our very complex national history. And I was able to visit the library before the pandemic back in 2019 and to sit with some of these documents. And now my memory of that experience has a very different nostalgic feel in light of our Zoom age. In fact, being able to physically examine the manuscript that I want to discuss today, which is in fact digitized, was quite invaluable. And this is not only because of what Walter Benjamin calls the aura of the original object, to get a little bit wonky on you here, but because I was able to get underneath some of the creases, figuratively, but also quite literally, and to determine some of the words and meanings. It was also nice to be greeted by the portraits of the Antiquarian Society, and if I remember correctly, among those were paintings of the Mathers, who played a prominent role in the story of my book and in the story of the Kabbalistic manuscript that I am going to discuss today. But before digging into the manuscript, I thought I should briefly describe how the book in which it plays a major part came about. And here I refer you to a slideshow that we have here. Thank you. I'll just prompt you. Yes. As some of you who are participating today may know, I'm an intellectual historian of early modern Jewish philosophy and Kabbalah, also as I've been introduced. And several years ago, my own American identity got the best of me. I started wondering whether there were any Kabbalistic or Jewish philosophical influences on early North American thought. So I began to explore, and to my surprise, I encountered a figure named Judah Monis, who was a Jew in the Boston area, presumably originally from Livorno, Italy. Monis had converted to Congregational Christianity in 1722 with the backing of the famed Puritan minister Increase Mather. And next slide, please. So this is Increase Mather. You can see here, actually, this is a painting of one of the collections of the AAS. With the support of Mather, Monis went on to become the first full-time Hebrew instructor at Harvard and the first person to publish a Hebrew grammar in North America. The next slide. Among other things, I was interested in the role that Monis's Judaism played in certain sectors of the colonial religious experiment. And as you can see here, I didn't have a portrait of Judah Monis, but we have his headstone here. And he was considered a rabbi until and even beyond his dying day, despite his conversion. You can see on his epitaph, on his gravestone. Key to his impact as a, quote, rabbinic Christian, unquote, were the discourses that he published after his baptism, which are full of Kabbalistic and Jewish philosophical language. Next slide. So from Monis, I looked forward in time at the influence of his Jewish-flavored baptismal discourses on Ezra Stiles, who we see here, who was an important congregational minister and the 7th president of Yale. And now we can switch to the overhead. This is an exciting project here because we get to see in real time how the overhead works, this overhead camera where we can show you some of the pieces of the collection. So I looked backward in time as well to increase Mather's own views on Jews and on American Messianism. And we can see here some of his works, the dissertation concerning the future conversion of the Jewish nation, and his Mystery of Israel's Salvation. And the AAS has a couple of original copies of these. I also began exploring some of Cotton Mather's uses of Jewish thought and Kabbalah. And incidentally, if you get a chance to read through these, you'll see some of that. And some of this I was very fortunate to have readily available to me through the magisterial edition also of Cotton Mather's Biblia Americana. This is the Son of Increase, as produced by a team led by Rainer Smolinski, who I believe is listening in today. And now I come to the manuscript that we are going to be looking at today, which I became aware of through rather unconventional means. And I'll explain. Sometime during the process of researching and thinking through the material for this book, the Dean of Humanities here at Rice University very graciously began promoting the idea that faculty should seek external residential fellowships in order to get out of our own bubbles, so to speak. And I had learned about the NEH Fellowship at the American Antiquarian Society, and I knew that the American Antiquarian Society housed some of the Mather family papers, so I decided to apply. Now, in order to write the strongest application possible, the proposal possible, I knew that it would be important to specify holdings important to my research. So I did what any good researcher would do. I went into the American Antiquarian Society online catalog. I typed in the Boolean search term Kabbalah, because that's what I was researching and writing on. And to my pleasant surprise, this manuscript that you see here from 1688 popped up, which was fully digitized already at the time, and which had been given the title, The Kabbalah of the Jews. You can see on the front if you flip back to the front page, or actually, yeah, also it says Jewish Kabbalah up here, but right, if you flip it open, it says The Kabbalah of the Jews. And this was the name given to it by its 1935 cataloger, R.W.G. Vail, who was the librarian at the time. This was accompanied by a note from Vail, which you can see penciled in here. And hopefully you can see this. I'll read it to you. It says, 17th century manuscript on the Jewish Kabbalah. Removed from pamphlet volume V93, which was made up of 17th century Quaker tracts, some of them bearing the autograph of Increase Mather. It is therefore possible that this manuscript also came from the Mather Library, end quote. So I was very excited, obviously, when I saw this. I immediately read through it several times, which was easy because it is scribed in beautiful handwriting. You can flip open to the first page here to show just how beautiful this handwriting is. It makes our job much easier. Sometimes I come across these manuscripts where, you think the person must have been a doctor. Sometimes they were, but, with the handwriting that they present, it's almost impossible to read. Here, we have beautiful, very clear handwriting. And upon reading through it, I noticed that at certain points, the conceptual language had an uncanny resemblance to some of the concept in Anne Conway's philosophy, which I was simultaneously and very serendipitously discussing with my dear friend Christia Mercer of Columbia University, who I believe is also listening in today. Just really briefly, Anne Conway was an important philosopher out of Warwickshire, England, who was in touch with the Cambridge Platonists and with Christian Kabbalistic circles in Europe. And I had known about an important Quaker figure named George Keith through his connection to Conway, who had made his way, George Keith had made his way to North America in the 1680s. So all of this, coupled with the fact that this manuscript had originally been cataloged with Quaker tractates, led me to believe that it was penned at least by someone from Keith's circle, if not Keith himself. I soon then read everything I could by and about Keith himself, and further investigation led me to the conclusion that he had written this epistle, which we will discuss today. And I think that Vail was right, that it was part of the Mather family library. In fact, it played an important role in a major debate between George Keith and his brand of Quakerism, and of all things, congregational Christianity as represented by Cotton Mather. Beyond that, it offers us an important window into early American Quaker thinking about Jewish thought, which of course is of great interest to me. And it also offers a view of a senior Christian Quaker responding to the philosophy of the German pietist Jakob Böhme. In fact, it is one of the earliest Kabbalistic readings of Böhme, presaging the likes of Hegel and others. And it also shows us the expansive reach had by European philosophical Kabbalah, which I had mentioned briefly, Keith had studied with Anne Conway and her circle. So for all of these reasons, at the very least, it is an important manuscript in my mind. And it is this manuscript and its ascription to George Keith that I really want to focus on today. So back to the slideshow. There we are. If we can look at slide number 7. Excellent. Okay, so yeah, back one. Okay, so this is George Keith. And before we get into the manuscript and the nitty-gritty there, I wanted to first lay out a little bit of the background of its author. So George Keith was born in Aberdeenshire in Scotland to a Presbyterian family. And in his early 20s, he joined the Society of Friends, and he soon became an intimate of George Fox, of William Penn, and of Robert Barclay, some names you may have heard of. In 1675, he was sent by William Penn to a place called Ragley Hall in Warwickshire, England, where he was to visit Anne Conway, who was already a known philosopher and noblewoman, and he was to try to convert her to Quakerism. At that point, Conway herself was deeply involved in the study of Kabbalah and even had a famous Christian Kabbalist living with her by the name of Francis Mercurius von Helmont. And in addition to his own important writings, Helmont was involved in the famous Kabbalah Denudata of 1677, which, just really briefly, was the largest collection of Jewish Kabbalistic texts in Latin up until that point. And it was headed up by the a German named Christian Knorr von Rosenroth, who will actually make a tangential appearance later in our story as well. Keith did, in fact, manage to convert Conway and her resident Kabbalist von Helmont to Quakerism, but in the process, Keith was also converted into a Quaker Kabbalist, and he became a tight part of Conway and Helmont's Kabbalistic circle. In 1685, he was sent to East Jersey to take up the post of Surveyor General, and in 1688, he seems to have written the epistle that Vail cataloged in 1935 that we saw, called the Kabbalah of the Jews. This epistle is directly addressing Keith's friend, the West Jersey Quaker leader Daniel Leeds. And it is responding to Leeds's book called The Temple of Wisdom for the Little World. Now we can advance in the slideshow. There it is. So this is the cover of the Temple of Wisdom for the Little World. This is a compendium of some of the works of the early 17th century German pietist Jakob Böhme, who I mentioned before, and it was published in Philadelphia in 1688. The Temple of Wisdom was one of the first books published south of New England, And as Leeds writes on the frontispiece, it's kind of hard to make out here, but I'll read it as a treating of the being of all beings, and whence everything hath its original, as in heaven, hell, angels, men and devils, earth, stars, and elements, and particularly of all mysteries concerning the soul, and of Adam before and after the fall. So it's, light bedtime reading here. It contains some fairly radical ideas, in fact, that are characteristic of Burma, like the union of light and darkness in God and the androgynous nature of the virginal Adam before the fall. And Keith sees in these ideas Kabbalistic concepts that he claims have been disguised and distorted by Burma. And through his letter to Leeds, he wants to set the record straight, and that's the manuscript that we have. The letter as we have it has no signature or other blatant identifying markers in relation to the author. So then how did I arrive at the idea that George Keith was the author? Well, one indication is the Kabbalistic content and the linguistic framing, which have clear parallels to Anne Conway's thought and to George Keith's own printed works. The conceptual parallels are far too complicated to get into here, but I will just say that it has to do with Adam Kadmon, which is an intricate idea of the primordial man coming out of the Kabbalistic tradition. And as the Kabbalists say, Hamevin Yavin, that is, one who understands will understand. I'll just leave it at that. But beyond the complex Kabbalistic content, there are other indicators that Keith was the author. These involve a peculiar character named Christian Lodewyk, who was an anti-Quaker former German who was now residing in Rhode Island in the 1680s. And prior to coming to America, Lodewyk seems to have been the tutor for the children of the famous Christian Kabbalist, Christian Noor von Rosenroth, who I mentioned before. He's the author of the Kabbalah Denudata, and with von Rosenroth, Keith had corresponded via mutual friends through the Conway Circle. In 1691, Lodewyk, who again is this German residing in Rhode Island at the time, corresponded with Cotton Mather, discussing a series of debates he had had with George Keith. And some of these contained Kabbalistically framed ideas, such as the resurrection body, as he frames it, and the transmigration of the souls. Lodewyk tells Cotton Mather that he is sending him 3 books by Keith. This is in a letter that we have, along with one of Keith's manuscripts, which was written in 1688. He explicitly says so. And of course, that's the precise date of the, quote, Kabbalah of the Jews, this antiquarian manuscript, which was filed, as you may remember, and not coincidentally, in the Mather family papers. Also in relation to some of the content of the debates, which Lodewyk describes to Mather and which are ideas discussed in the manuscript, it seems incontrovertible that the epistle was written by George Keith. So of course, I got excited at this point, at this finding, and my next step was to try to verify the handwriting. I figured that if I could match the handwriting to that of George Keith, it would be an open and closed case. So next slide. Okay, so I found several documents that we know are in Keith's handwriting, as they have his direct signature. And here are 2 of these documents. You can see one from the British Library, one from the Monmouth County Historical Association. And then next slide, if we zoom in here. Okay, these are his signature, as we can see. One is his account ledger, so we know it has an official signature. And the other has the identical signature here. I compared the handwriting here to the American Antiquarian Society manuscript, the Kabbalah of the Jews, and next slide. Okay, here is a comparison of the 2, and next slide. I was extremely disappointed because you can see here that it's a completely different handwriting. George Keith clearly did not pen this manuscript. You know, we can see here, I'm comparing the same word here, friend. But then I thought for a minute, you know, okay, what's going on here? If Christian Lodewyk told Cotton Mather that he was sending him 3 books and a manuscript of Keith's, then it might be worthwhile to check Christian Lodewyk's handwriting. Unfortunately, to the best of my knowledge, the letter that he wrote to Cotton Mather in 1691 is only available in the 1692 print edition, unless anybody has information that I would love to hear of where its whereabouts. So then the next slide. I was able to find another letter autographed by Lodewyk that's housed at the Rhode Island Historical Society. And as you can see, the handwriting here is identical. We can zoom in, I think the next slide. Okay, here it's more pronounced and we can see identical words that I prepared. He had understand or understandings. It's identical handwriting. So back to the manuscript for if we look at the overhead camera. Wait a minute here. Okay, so on page 6 here of the manuscript, it is written, if you look very close towards the top where Elizabeth is pointing at the 47.3, if you look in the other corner, the part that leads up to the 47.3, yes, see Yesa 43.7. So Yesa here, this term Yesa, is shorthand for the Germanic version of the name Isaiah, that is Yesaya, right? And there's absolutely no reason that a Scotsman like Keith would write this in an English language document. And it rather points to a Germanic hand, someone who's thinking partly in German. And remember, Lodewyk was originally from Eilenburg near Leipzig, Germany. So graphologically and orthographically, all evidence points to Christian Lodewyk as the scribe of the Kabbalah of the Jews. But even though he had worked under the great Christian Kabbalist Nor von Rosenrath, and he may have learned some Kabbalah from him, his disdain for Kabbalah is represented in his letter to Mather, and his anti-Quaker stance seemed to rule him out as the author of this Quaker Kabbalistic text. With his mention of sending a manuscript of Keith's work to Mather, it stands to reason that Keith was the original author, and Lodewyk had copied it out in his own hand and sent it to Mather. So in conclusion, what the American Antiquarian Society houses in this piece that we see in front of us here, in what R.W.G. Vail titled The Kabbalah of the Jews, is actually a significant, previously unknown piece of early modern Christian Kabbalah. It's a piece that links Anne Conway and Christian Nor von Rosenrath to the shores of America. It's a piece that sheds Kabbalistic light on the Christian Quakerism of George Keith and his supporters, such as Daniel Leeds. And it's one of the earliest known instances of the reading the Theosophy of Yaakov Burma through an explicitly Kabbalistic lens. And also it's a piece that brings into focus a previously little explored aspect of the thought of Cotton Mather, his relationship to the relatively unknown Christian Lodewyk, and their theological dispute with Quakerism. Yet Vail was right in that all of these elements deeply involve reflections deriving from Jewish Kabbalah. Again, we don't have time to dig deeply into those rather complex reflections today, but if you're interested, then I refer you to my book, of course. And it's my hope that my book can at least be a starting point, and in reflecting on texts such as George Keith's epistle to Daniel Leeds, that it can contribute to a fuller understanding of the rather interreligious, that's a tongue twister there, intricate interreligious nature of early colonial American religious thought. And I'll leave it at that before I get myself into any more tongue twisters. Thank you very much. And I'm happy to try to answer any questions.
Great. Thank you very much, Brian. It's a pleasure to have you here today. And you've given us a lot to, I think, to unwrap and unravel here. I'd love to really kind of just start with talking a little bit more about your research in particular. You've given us a really great anecdote to start with regarding how you've kind of serendipitously discovered this document, discovered this manuscript, and how you've began to kind of look at it in terms of looking at its digital surrogate. I'd love to kind of talk more about your experience reading that digital copy and the differences in actually coming to AAS and visiting our reading room and actually looking at the actual document itself and what that meant to you, personally as a researcher, but also I know a lot of folks here are also instructors themselves who use both digital surrogates in their classrooms as well as whenever possible, taking their students to special collections and the like to give them some experience at this themselves. So could you just kind of unpack how you read the digital copy and how you then had to reread the original?
Okay, yeah, that's an interesting question given the nature of our conversation here over digital space and sort of this move that we've all faced with the pandemic of doing everything almost digitally at this point. I should certainly say that the digital copy that you have available to the public is excellent. Whoever your photographer was did a fantastic job. So I was able to make do with that for a lot of my work. However, and this is a big however, as I said sort of towards the beginning, there are, even in the digital manuscript on the corners, in some places, there are creases, for example. So it was nice to be able to sort of very carefully flip back the creases and see what the words were underneath. Now, this was important to my project because as an appendix to my book, I transcribed the manuscript and I offer it sort of in full in my transcription as an appendix. So for those purposes, it was really crucial for me to get every single word right, including the thes and the ands, and all of these things that are even in corner creases that I couldn't see over the digital form. And then another point is, there's nothing like sitting with a text. I don't know, this is something that doesn't necessarily have to do with scholarship per se, I don't know, but, it's just to feel this connection of, here's a document that was written in 1688 and you have it in front of you. You are able to tangibly feel it somehow. Somehow it gives a sense in some case, again, back to this idea of the aura maybe, of being connected to the past in some way. I know that's a very mystical way of looking at things, but I think all of us researchers who have worked with manuscripts have that same sentiment in some way. So
absolutely. No, absolutely. Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that. As noted at the beginning of the talk, the Q&A is open. So if you do have a question for Brian, you can type those in. Some are coming in now. So please continue to do that and look at those that are already posted. Again, you can upvote those if you'd like to see one of those discussed. Brian, before we kind of get to some of these questions that have been posted already, you already kind of anticipated one of my questions regarding the appendices that you offer. You include a transcription of the Kabbalah of the Jews. You also include a transcription and translation of an oration by Keith and a glossary. Just again, thinking through process and thinking through what you do with a manuscript and how that manuscript evolves. What were the decisions going into creating and adding these appendices, and what were the challenges in doing so?
Okay, so I wanted to make my ultimate goal there with providing these as appendices was to make as much of the textual evidence available as possible to the readers, so that if anybody has a dispute with some of my findings, I completely welcome that. I'd love to hear what they might have to say. But I always wanted to be based on textual evidence. So I thought the easiest way was to provide these critical apparati at the end of the book here. It's also, as I tried to illustrate here, hopefully I illustrated in some successful manner. I think this, for example, this specific piece, there are other pieces as well as you're mentioning, but I think that this is a very important piece to the entire story that I'm trying to tell. And not only is it an important piece to the entire story, but it's an important piece in understanding some of the interreligious dynamics of the colonial situation. So I wanted to, what I thought that I could make these available through the book, through these appendices, and that was sort of the thought here in terms of providing that. And then, hopefully it'll open up other researchers to start looking at the texts themselves and not just what I have to say about the texts.
Great. We have a lot of questions coming in now, and some of them are, as you can imagine, very specific. So I kind of wanted to just add one more question in before we get to those, discussing all of the subjects of the book. So Cotton and Increase Mather, George Keith, etc. How did your subjects first encounter the Kabbalah, and how widely read was the work? How wide was the circle of Christian engagement with Jewish mysticism and Jewish thought in general?
Okay, yeah. So that's a question that I've had throughout as well. It's my sense from the textual evidence that I have at hand, so I'll start with sort of the latter part of your question. The extent of engagement with the Kabbalistic material was not great. That is, there doesn't seem to have been a new sort of Kabbalistic circle or anything to that effect that broke out in full force on the North American continent. However, and this is an important caveat, the people who were engaged in these things were really some of the elite thinkers of this period, people who were very much involved in policymaking, people who were very much involved in, directing even just the whole new direction of, for example, congregational Christianity. And I have in mind here, for example, people like Ezra Stiles, who really had this idea of, so Ezra Stiles was the 7th president of Yale. He was also very much he was very much involved in setting up Brown University, and he was an important congregational minister in Rhode Island. And he was very much explicit about his idea that everybody who comes through the gates of Yale needs to learn Hebrew. Everybody should be learning Talmudic literature, including the Kabbalistic literature, and that this is really at the heart and the backbone of an understanding of Christianity in some way. So, it's when we're looking at people like this, I think it's quite significant. Now, how did all of these folks get involved with Kabbalah? That's basically the entire topic of my book. So I could go on for hours and hours about this. But as I said, I started with this figure, Judah Monis, the first full-time Hebrew instructor at Harvard, who had the backing of Increase Mather, who was converted to Congregational Christianity under the tutelage of Increase Mather. And he seems to have had quite an influence upon this sort of group of people that I'm looking at as well, that he brought from his Judaism certain ideas that affected them in some way.
Thank you. We have a question. One of the participants here asks really about what the Kabbalah of the Jews manuscript actually contains. Could you give us a little summary, actually, of its contents in just a few lines?
Yeah, I mean, it's not a very clear, again, it's sort of an epistle aimed at this specific figure, Daniel Leeds. It doesn't really have a clear thesis other than, it's taking Leeds to task. I don't know if I would say taking Leeds to task, but it's certainly taking Yaakov Burma to task. So Leeds, as I mentioned in the talk, Daniel Leeds had published this book, which is basically a compendium of the thought of Yaakov Burma. And in this epistle, Keith is basically trying to say, well, everything that's found there, everything that's found in this thought of Yaakov Burma is basically a corrupt reading of the Kabbalah. It's a corrupt reading of Kabbalistic texts and Kabbalistic lore. And basically at the heart of this whole Kabbalistic process is this idea that I mentioned very briefly, and then I tried to kind of skirt over, of Adam Kadmon, this idea of the primordial man, which he reads as this kind of idea of a cosmic Christ in some way. It's a very complex idea, but he thinks it's coming out of the Jewish tradition, that he gives it a very Christological reading, certainly, and he sees that Yaakov Burma's texts and ideas are actually coming from that, as far as he's able to determine. So that's sort of in a nutshell, it's responding to this book that was published in the North American content that has very much a theosophical character to it.
Great, thank you. We have a question here from Betsy Kasdan, who asks, I wonder if Keith's Kabbalistic views were part of why he was disowned by Quakers in both Pennsylvania and England, essentially for heresy and theological error. Have you looked at his disownment proceedings?
Okay, great question. Yes, I've looked at the proceedings, and my answer to this question is I wonder too if his Kabbalistic views were part of this. There's nothing explicit in there of mention about Kabbalah. There's in the whole schism, as far as I know, although there are people who are much more expert in this than I am, but as far as I have been able to tell, there's no explicit reference to anything Kabbalistic. However, there is reference to certain ideas of, again, I don't want to get into the weeds here, but this notion of an inner and an outer Christ, this idea of sort of a dual sense of salvation, which to my mind, and I try to show textually and conceptually, that he is taking some of these ideas from his Kabbalistic reading of Christian history. So I do think there is something to that, although it never gets explicitly stated, or the case is never explicitly made for that.
Great, thank you. Not to get too far into the weeds, I am looking through the Q&A scroll here a little bit, and I notice a few folks are generally just unclear about what the Kabbalah is. So maybe in just a few moments, before we get further into the weeds here and into the text that you write, what are the basic tenets of the Kabbalah?
Okay, so Kabbalah literally means reception. It's this idea of a received tradition from usually thought by word of mouth. Some people have from Moses at Sinai all the way down to our day, from the teacher to disciple. Some people back that up all the way to Adam, the first Adam, that Adam was somehow taught or revealed something in the Garden of Eden, this sort of secret knowledge of the workings and understandings of the universe. So it's really the esoteric lore of Judaism. Now it gets transformed in early modern, first of all, Renaissance and then early modern Europe. It's a lot of the ideas of Kabbalah are adopted and adapted by Christian thinkers, by certain Christian thinkers. And it's related to this idea of a whole Prisca Theologia tradition, this idea of sort of an ancient, pristine theology that pervades all true thought. And again, going back to Adam or going back to Moses at Sinai, and the idea is if you read the Bible correctly, you can understand the inner workings of God. And then it gets cast in various ways that these inner workings of God point to the figure of Christ as the final salvation in the Christian context. So I don't know if that answers, but I mean, I could go on for hours and hours of what is.
I think that helps a bit. And here's a follow-up to that, because I know in your book you do offer a really nice introduction to the Kabbalah and its evolution, as well as a really helpful glossary in the appendix, which I will confess I've referred back to often. Just a side question here, because you do mention that the Kabbalah was translated into Latin. You mentioned a moment ago that it really is the basis of the Kabbalah is this oral tradition, but then folks have to read the Bible, or read the text. So is there some debate amongst those during this time about what might be lost in that transmission by reading versus oral tradition, and by reading perhaps a translated text of it?
Oh, lots.
Yeah.
So there is first of all, there's a movement to learn Hebrew, and there's this idea that without understanding the original language, a lot gets lost. There's a need to read it in the original. That's why, for example, someone like Judah Monis becomes central to the picture. Again, first full-time Hebrew instructor at Harvard. That's why Ezra Stiles, has this idea that everybody who's coming through Yale should be learning Hebrew. And he has this idea that at the very least, if, his students, when they die, they should be able to understand what the angels are saying to them when they reach the pearly gates. So there is this element of reading the texts in the original. It's a lot of Kabbalah. There's a long history and an intricate history of Christian Hebraism involved here, where, the idea of understanding philologically and understanding textually and contextually the texts of the Hebrew Bible in order to understand the truth of Christianity. So that's a big part. And, another part is that a lot of Kabbalistic thought is very much linguistically based. It's a linguistic type of mysticism. There's an idea that, starting with the book of Genesis, even if anybody remembers or has read it, this idea that God spoke the world into creation. The first thing is, and God said, let there be light, and there was light. He's speaking his creation forth. This gets variably translated as certain ideas of logos, for example, but for Jewish mysticism, it's very, very heavily this idea that the language that God speaks is the building, it really makes up the building blocks of creation. So without understanding that, you've got nothing. Now, yeah, there is certainly your question is very complex here. So I'm trying to get at everything you said here. Certainly, there's a lot of debate going on about this idea of transmission. And certainly the people I look at all say, including George Keith himself, that, yeah, basically the Jews got it wrong. They have this form of Kabbalah, but it's not saying, it got corrupted along the way. We, as good Quakers in his case, or, various forms of Christianity in other cases, have a better understanding of what this Kabbalah means if we look at the texts in their original, and we can sort of separate the wheat from the chaff, so to speak, and find the true kernels of this esoteric wisdom. Yeah, so there's a lot of debate about all of this going on.
Thank you. Thank you for unpacking some of that. There are several questions. I'm going to combine a few here that are really interested in the Keithian schism and the way in which the Kabbalah influences Keith's views. So could you unpack that a little bit and maybe even discuss, if possible, give us a little hint or preview of the ways in which the Kabbalah was integrated into that thread of Quakerism?
Yeah, again, so I'm not a huge expert on the Keithian schism, although it's very important to my story here. There's a wonderful tiny little book it's an easy read because it's a short book by Madeline Ward on this topic, which is fantastic. So I refer anybody who's interested to that. However, yeah, part of this schism certainly has to do with his ideas of, like I said, this inward light and this outward Christ. And he wants to have his cake and eat it too, it seems. He wants to have this idea of a historical Jesus who preserves this idea of the Gospels as being very much important and integral to the whole Christian process, which at this point, the Society of Friends are not very happy with this idea. But at the same time, he's trying to assert this idea that everybody has the inward light that if properly cultivated, can lead to individual salvation. So this seems to stand really at the heart of the schism here.
Great, thank you. We have another question here asking if you've seen any influences from J.B. Van Helmont in these materials. We know that Cotton Mather read J.B. and adopted it to his medical work. Right,
not to my knowledge, although I wasn't looking for it in all honesty, so I don't know, but yeah, not to my knowledge. Certainly the younger Van Helmont, there's clear influence, and this involves, for example, his views on reincarnation, or what he calls revolution of the souls, that, there's a lot of that makes its way even into this manuscript. And we know that he was in those ways influencing Keith in some of his other writings as well. But in terms of the father, I'm not sure, in all honesty, I don't know. It's a topic for research for somebody out there.
These are the best kinds of books, right, that lead to more questions. I think we have time for two more questions here. So this is coming from Jerry Frost, and you might need to unpack who Daniel Leeds is in this response. But Jerry asks, my assumption as to why Daniel Leeds became such a strong proponent of Keith was because the meeting had disciplined him for referring to, quote, Lord Penn in his almanac. Now your evidence seems to indicate that Leeds was sympathetic to Keith's intellectual probing. Do you have other evidence about Leeds?
Okay, so Daniel Leeds is an interesting figure in and of himself. He ran into all kinds of trouble, not only here with his this publication of Burma's sort of anthology, but he had also published an almanac which got him into trouble because, it's based on the zodiac, and, there were seen in there things that were of an unorthodox nature. To my knowledge, he was part of this Keithian schism sort of from the get-go, that he was very much allied with Keith and with his stance along the way. In fact, he picked up where Keith left off. When Keith went back to England, Keith sort of acted as a representative of this sort of Christian Quakerism, as again Madeline Ward calls it, and others, that so he seems to have been there along with Keith sort of from the get-go, as far as I understand it.
I think we have time for one more question, and you'll have to excuse me. I'm going to again try to combine questions here. But overall, the question that several folks are interested in revolves around Freemasonry. And folks want to know if you can discuss how Kabbalistic texts influenced the Freemasons. They mentioned individuals in one case, such as George Washington and other founders. And I do want to make a note that in your introduction, you do make a very brief note to both Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, who were also interested in the Kabbalah.
Yeah, so I tried to look into it a little bit, and it didn't lead me very far. I wish it would have led me further. It's because of the reason why I started looking into this is because a lot of the early Freemasons in this country, well, not a lot, but the Freemasons were also open to Jews. And there were several Jews who were involved with the Freemasons. And this is also certainly within New England. And there's even this King David Lodge, which has a, Jewish presence. Their leader at a certain point is a Jewish person. I was, in my very minimal digging, I was unable to come up with anything specific. However, yeah, there is Kabbalistic influence in later developments in Freemasonry. At this earlier stage, I was unable to come up with anything specifically significant. I'd love if somebody does come up with something. It's, there's a woman named Martha Keith Schuchart, who has written about this topic, where in England, though. In the American context, as far as I'm aware, I don't know at this earlier stage. There are later Freemasons who pick up on Kabbalistic themes, like this very controversial figure, Albert Pike, who I think his statue was recently torn down. I think he was the only Confederate general to have a statue in the DC area, if I'm not mistaken. He was a Confederate general, and he, had all kinds of controversial ideas. There are thoughts that, he may have been the founder or progenitor of the Ku Klux Klan, for example. Again, I don't know a lot of the history there, but he's a later Freemason who does take a lot of these Kabbalistic ideas and incorporates them into his Masonic writings. So there is a connection there. Oh yes, Marcia Schuchart, yes. So yeah, I don't know if that answers the question.
Well, thank you very much, Brian. I'm looking at the time, and we're unfortunately at that limit, but I do want to thank you very much for joining us today. And of course, I'd like to thank everybody else for attending. So thank you, Brian.
Thanks for hosting me.
It was a great pleasure, and really wonderful to kind of get insight on, one of our collection items. So we appreciate it. Our next program is an afternoon book talk sponsored by the Program in the History of the Book in American Culture. You can join us on April 28th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time to hear Jennifer Putzi discuss her new book, Fair Copy, Relational Poetics and the Antebellum American Women's Poetry. Our next public program, Campers, Veterans, Tramps, and More, tracking the hidden origins of a national outdoor pastime in the 19th century, takes place on May 3rd at 7 p.m., and it features UC Boulder professor Phoebe Young. With that, again, thank you all for joining us today. I hope to see you in the chat next time.